And let me just say, in the writing industry, if someone publishes an essay about you, you know shit's about to get real. What's up, book nerds? I'm Lucky's Universe, and in today's video we're going to be discussing an uncomfortable, slightly controversial, but altogether in my opinion important topic, My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. I have wanted to read this book ever since it was released back in March this year and started making its way around the book community. Alright, let's get into it. My Dark Vanessa works along two timelines. One of our main character, Vanessa, at 15, entering into what she believes to be an exciting and loving relationship with her 40-year-old English teacher, and then an older version of Vanessa 20-odd years later in 2017, forced to rethink that relationship as a former student comes out and accuses Strain of sexual harassment and abuse. I'm just gonna start this right off the bat with, I love this book. I hate this book, but I love this book, and I'm going to tell you why, but first I'm going to unpack some of the controversy that was surrounding this novel even before its release. First of all, it's always a risky decision to publish something about sexual abuse because there will always be critics and journalists and even everyday people like you and me ready to jump on an author and accuse them of exploiting the Me Too movement or capitalizing off victims of abuse. This is unfortunately because some authors will actually do that, and it makes it difficult for other authors who have experienced abuse themselves and want to get their story out there, or authors who just feel really strongly about the subject and want to get people thinking about it. Second of all, sorry, that just sounds weird. That sounds weird saying second of all. It sounds like a title you give someone in the Middle Ages. Sir Gregory, second of all. I digress. Second of all, we have to talk about the Oprah in the room. Getting an endorsement from the Oprah Winfrey can shoot your product into the spotlight, and authors can only ever dream of having their novel chosen for her book club. In January this year, Oprah revealed her latest pick, a book titled American Dirt, which details a Mexican mother and son journeying to the border after a cartel murders their family. Soon afterward, Twitter did what it does best. It popped off. People were outraged, saying that the story was stereotypical, that it appropriated Mexican culture, and the largest portion of complaints seemed to be about the author, who, up until 2016, identified as white. Critics claimed that a white author writing about Mexican culture in such a generalized way was basically brownface. Although later the author revealed that she had a Puerto Rican grandmother, it still didn't clear up the issue that the story was about migrants, but written by an American author for American readers. Which seemed to be people's main grievance, because even now we are still engaged in a constant battle with publishing companies for POC representation, not just in stories, but in authors. Now, I haven't read American Dirt, so I can't speak for its contents. I can only go off reviews and summaries. And from what I've learned, POC critics tend to label this story as apolitical, or providing a very nice or censored POC story that seems to be written to make white readers feel comfortable. But what does American Dirt have to do with My Dark Vanessa? Stay with me. There was a memoir published back in 2014 titled Excavation, written by Latinx author Wendy C. Ortiz. It detailed her 5-year relationship with her 8th grade English teacher that took place when she was a teenager. When word began stirring of My Dark Vanessa's upcoming release and rumors that the story sold for 7 figures, Ortiz wasted no time in pointing out the alarming similarities between her story and Kate Elizabeth Russell's, calling it a fictionalized version of what Ortiz herself actually went through. The ease in which Russell's book was snatched up by publishers was also a point of contention, as Ortiz was rejected multiple times from multiple companies, and this was very obviously due to the publishing industry being overwhelmingly white occupied. Ortiz published an essay on this situation. And let me just say, in the writing industry, if someone publishes an essay about you, you know shit's about to get real. The reason that all of this ties into the American Dirt controversy is that they both encompass a similar theme of who is allowed to write what. Can people who don't identify as POC write POC stories? And can people who have never experienced sexual abuse write about sexual abuse? There were accusations that Russell plagiarized Ortiz's memoir, simply writing a white version of it, although I will point out that these accusations did not come from Ortiz herself, rather her fans and her followers. Eventually, Russell had to come out with a statement saying that she started writing My Dark Vanessa years before Excavation was even published, and the contents were inspired by her own experiences as a teenager. Russell had not wanted that information to be public, as she felt that opening up about her situation and her experiences would re-traumatize her, and she also didn't feel that victims of abuse should be pressured to come forward with their stories when they're not ready, and she actually touches on this point in her novel. Ortiz later released her own statement saying that she stood behind everything that she said in her essay about the white-dominated publishing industry, about Latinx and marginalized cultures being excluded from bigger companies, and the suspicious parallels that could be drawn between Excavations and My Dark Vanessa, pointing out that any decent publishing team who thought a book was going to be successful should be making sure that that book isn't similar to any other stories. Now, don't ask me where I stand on this situation. Even though I just went over the main points of the controversy, I still probably don't know enough about it to make an informed decision. I just wanted to give some background to My Dark Vanessa, and I feel like it's always a good idea to bring attention to misrepresentation, cultural bias, and appropriation in the book world. So, now that you have some context for this novel, I'm going to break down some scenes in My Dark Vanessa that hit me hard. The rest of this video will contain spoilers, so if you haven't read the book, proceed at your own risk. I want to talk about the beginning of Vanessa and Strain's relationship back when she was 15. The author actually starts the book with the older Vanessa's perspective, thinking about the accusations concerning Strain and how that makes her feel, before backtracking to Vanessa at 15 and the beginning of their romance. Had the author begun with 15-year-old Vanessa, we might not have actually interpreted Strain's early behaviors as predatory, rather just a teacher being polite and friendly to a student. This is what makes this story so intriguing. We're in first person, seeing the story through Vanessa's eyes, interpreting Strain's actions as a 15-year-old does. But since we get snippets of the older Vanessa and knowing what we do about Strain, we are also privy to every inch of Strain's manipulative and downright icky mind works. One of the first pieces of dialogue that gave me the bad feels was when Vanessa joined her school's creative writing club, run by Strain, and he asks her why she isn't friends with this other student named Jenny, because they used to be so close, and he refers to Jenny as the little queen of the Nile, because apparently her hair just reminds him of Cleopatra. Even though he quickly followed it up by referring to another student as the boy with the sideburns, which made it seem like he just identified everyone by their hair, something sat ill with me at the idea of a teacher likening a young female student to a historical character who represents beauty and is almost always sexualized. During this scene, Strain also comments on Vanessa's style of dress, and we are immediately hit in the face with just how deep Vanessa's self-esteem and low confidence issues run. A small compliment about her dress sows the first seeds of obsession within her, and no doubt Strain wanted her to have this exact reaction. It's all very calculated on Strain's part. He would have Vanessa believe that he fell in love with her because she was different, she was special, a soul like his own. The real reason, however, was because Vanessa was easily identifiable as isolated and low in confidence. I can't remember exactly when this was mentioned, but somewhere in the story, Vanessa was thinking about sitting in Strain's classroom and remembering Strain's eyes wandering over the student, looking at Jenny, and then looking at her. And she interpreted this as Strain passing over Jenny because he saw something special in Vanessa, when really Strain was probably scoping out Jenny as a potential victim as well, but declined due to her popularity and self-assurance. Jenny couldn't be manipulated as easily as Vanessa. In fact, Strain also tells Vanessa that he also likes being alone, and there's nothing wrong with that, and she shouldn't feel pressured to be social. I've never found a more appropriate situation in which to use the phrase, "the lion, the witch, and the audacity of this bitch." Strain made sure that Vanessa stayed isolated. From then on, Strain begins subtly pursuing Vanessa. He seeks her out when she's alone, purely to discuss simple, general matters, but his speech is littered with perverse innuendos that both confuse and interest Vanessa. He compares her hair to the color of maple leaves, showers her with endless compliments, touches her hands, gives her sexually suggestive reading material, all the while assuring her that she is far more mature than any other student he's had. Throughout all this, we, the readers, can only sit back and watch as Strain molds Vanessa into his ideal victim. She only reads the materials that he gives her, she sees his opinions as facts, and treats him like the only one who understands her. Strain, she later realizes, gives her something that she's never had, a sense of power. Thanks to him, she begins to see herself as he does, as special, as different. It's both sad, heartbreaking, and gross, all at the same time. A pivotal scene in my Dark Vanessa has to be the knee touching scene. This whole thing made me want to vomit. So Vanessa is in her English class and Strain is marking their assignments. He calls her up to his desk and references a particular sentence in her assignment and asks her,
"Did you mean to sound sexy here?"
He then says,
"I don't want to embarrass you."
which to Vanessa feels like a test, like she has to prove that she really is as mature as he thinks. While they're sitting together, it happens. Strain puts a hand on her knee, on her thigh, and whispers to her that he feels that she is a dark romantic, like himself. During the story, we get quite a few moments where Vanessa seems to disassociate mentally. Even though when Strain is doing his sleazy old man things to her and she feels like she is in control, she is consenting, she sometimes feels outside of herself. Even at 15, her mind was struggling to cope with her abuse through disassociation. This very thing, this being outside of herself, happens during the knee touching scene and continues to happen to Vanessa throughout her whole life. Unfortunately, as much as it pains me, I feel like we have to talk about the first time Vanessa and Strain have sex, or more appropriately, the first time Strain rapes Vanessa. After finishing this book, I can safely say that this was the most disturbing scene for me to read. The way that Strain asks for permission before he does anything and makes Vanessa feel like she's in control of their intimacy, that like he's such a gentleman, he's so kind to her during the whole experience, it just sickens me. After a while, Strain begins asking permission for things after he does those things, like things that Vanessa doesn't even fully understand, and that's what gets to me. Because it's easy to push everything onto Vanessa, to say that she wanted it, she said yes, so can we really place all the blame onto Strain? We forget that Vanessa is 15, like mature for her age or not, biologically, her brain is not developed enough for her to consent to sex with full knowledge. Throughout this whole scene, Vanessa is guilted into having sex with Strain. At first, Strain promises that they won't go any further than him going down on her, which seems to relieve Vanessa as that's all that she's comfortable doing. But later, when Strain decides that he wants to fully do the deed, Vanessa feels like since he was so kind and understanding, that she owes him that. Throughout it all, Vanessa is in pain, she's crying, she's clearly not okay with it, but Strain keeps assuring her that that's all normal. Again, afterwards, Vanessa is numb to herself. She feels, for a brief moment, dirty and disgusting and worthless. She's clearly traumatized by Strain forcing himself on her, but doesn't want to say anything because she still wants to prove to Strain that she's mature enough to handle him. This whole scene just haunts me. If you could sit through all of that with a straight face, you must have read some fucked up shit. In ways, I liked that the author didn't hold back in this scene. She didn't sugarcoat it, she didn't romanticize it as many writers tend to do with student-teacher relationships. The act of rape is disgusting, so she made it disgusting. Simple as that. Okay, so moving on from specific scenes to the more generalized themes of the book, let's talk about Vanessa's obsession with the novel Lolita. Not everybody has read Lolita, but almost everyone, at least in the literature world, has heard the name. Lolita was a highly controversial novel written in 1955 by Vladimir Nabokov. It tells the story of a middle-aged literature professor who becomes obsessed with a 12-year-old girl named Dolores, and they enter into a relationship after he becomes her stepfather, and he affectionately nicknames her Lolita. Throughout the story, the professor, Humbert, as the narrator, is consistently justifying his behavior towards Dolores. But Dolores herself is actually given very little character by Humbert, aside from being the object of his desires. The readers never really get to understand Dolores's feelings on the whole situation, and that can be interpreted in so many different ways. The main parallel that you can draw between Lolita and My Dark Vanessa, or more accurately, Humbert and Strain, is that they both view their victims not as a person, but as a dream or a memory. Humbert is the only one who refers to Dolores as Lolita, and Strain refers to Vanessa as My Dark Vanessa. Both characters have fixed a certain persona onto their victims, which dilutes them into believing that since that persona, that Lolita or that Dark Vanessa, is too perfect to be human, their desires can't be wrong. It would only be wrong if they were human girls. Strain gives Vanessa a copy of this Lolita and teaches her to interpret it as a great love story, as their love story, and Vanessa becomes fixated on it. Eventually, as we read from the older Vanessa's perspective, we learn that she often confuses events in the novel with events from her real life. A lot of reviews have labeled My Dark Vanessa as sort of an inverse Lolita, as the 1955 novel is written from the perspective of the offender, whereas My Dark Vanessa gives us the viewpoint of the victim. Whilst Humbert writes that he couldn't control himself, he had no choice but to fall in love with Lolita, My Dark Vanessa gives us a different side of the story. It shows us what it's like to be the object of an abuser. There were critics back in the day that said that Lolita was not actually about a man corrupting an innocent child, but about a child exploiting a weak-willed man. Unfortunately, it's not the first recorded case of victim blaming. Strain plays a lot into this excuse, saying that Vanessa seduced him, that he had no choice but to fall in love with her, that she has all of the power over him, and in the end, this is how he controls her to the very end. Okay, so lastly, I want to talk about the author's subtle commentary about victims of abuse feeling pressured to come forward about their stories even when they're not ready. I was shocked at the behavior of the journalist character in My Dark Vanessa, who hounded the older Vanessa, trying to get her to be part of this article that she was writing about Strain and his current accusations. And Vanessa had to struggle with these feelings of guilt, feeling like she was being selfish because she didn't want to talk about what had happened to her. And this was partly because she still had to come to terms with the fact that her relationship with Strain was abuse, and partly because she just wasn't ready. I really appreciated the older Vanessa's therapist in this story, who acted as sort of the information giver, like the fact deliverer, and reassured Vanessa that she didn't have to say anything that she didn't want to. If talking about something traumatizing before she was ready was gonna hurt her, she wasn't betraying anyone by staying quiet. I feel like this point doesn't just apply to victims of sexual abuse, but just any personal experiences like grief or mental health issues, or like your love life, your relationships. If you don't feel comfortable talking about it, nobody should make you feel guilty about it. But if you are okay with talking about it, come forth and prosper, my friend. I think I'm gonna leave it there, because this is a long video. I'll conclude this by saying that as controversial and repulsive as My Dark Vanessa is, it was well worth the read. It gave me a lot to think about, and I hope that if you have read it or if you plan to read it, it gives you something to think about as well. Okay, let's lighten this up. If you don't already follow me on TikTok, go check that out. I post some pretty cool stuff on there. I will also leave a link to my Goodreads and my Twitter account below if you want to keep up with what I'm reading. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you later.